You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Always a privilege, always a treat to have Dr. Rafael Medoff on a broadcast. He's a founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, author of more than 20 books about Jewish history, the Holocaust. His latest book is called America and the Holocaust, a documentary history, published by the Jewish Publication Society and University of Nebraska Press. But we invited him to our broadcast because he wrote a fascinating article about Nancy Pelosi's father and the Jews. Good to have you back.
Hi, Zev. Thanks for having me.
And thank you. So I know there's a lot of attention. Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan and she had bipartisan support, and people were happy that she took a strong stand. But you wrote a fascinating article that she learned this from her father. Her father, during the Holocaust, took a strong stand, even though he was somebody who was a Democrat, and it wasn't popular being a Democratic congressman to go against FDR, the president, but he did so. So let's go back to those years.
You know, there's an interesting theme that runs through much of Nancy Pelosi's political career, and that is with regard to Chinese human rights abuses, she has often been very outspoken. Much more so than many of her colleagues in the Democratic Party, and occasionally bring her into conflict with a Democratic president. It's to her credit that, for example, she differed from President Bill Clinton with regard to China's oppression of Tibet. And now in recent days, we've been reading about how the Biden administration was trying to pressure her to cancel a planned visit to Taiwan because the communist Chinese are upset. And yet she defied her president and did it anyway. And that led me to think about what influences in her life might have helped shape this approach. Many years ago, in the course of my research on the Bergson Group, these were Holocaust rescue advocates in the United States who used newspaper ads and rallies to try to pressure the Roosevelt administration to help Jews during the Holocaust.
And of course, the playwright Ben Hecht.
Yes, Hecht was part of that Bergson Group. They were what today we would call a political action committee. But they were very much dissidents in those days. They were operating outside the mainstream of the established Jewish organizations. One of the hallmarks of the Bergson Group's activism was that it was very good at mobilizing members of Congress to try to put pressure on President Franklin Roosevelt on the Jewish refugee issue. And to Bergson's credit, he didn't just approach congressmen who were in his political camp, but he reached out to both Republicans and Democrats. And that's one of the more instructive aspects of the history of the Bergson Group, this willingness to reach across the aisle. Because when it came to something like genocide, to rescuing Jewish refugees, it really shouldn't have mattered whether one was a Democrat or a Republican. But in terms of putting pressure on FDR, it was very important to try to bring Democratic congressmen into the fold. And I found in my research that Nancy Pelosi's father, Thomas D'Alessandro Jr., who was a Democratic congressman from Maryland, was one of those who was a supporter of the Bergson Group's somewhat controversial activities during the 1940s.
Let's set this stage because FDR, the President Roosevelt, didn't really want to get involved in saving Jews and helping Jews. And he was forced to do so because of the Bergson Group and other pressure. But let's look at his mindset and what he didn't do and what, at the end of the day, what came about because of Nancy Pelosi's father and others.
President Roosevelt's policy toward the issue of the Jewish refugees during the Holocaust was best summed up in Professor David Wyman's famous book titled The Abandonment of the Jews. And indeed, much of the history of how Americans responded to the Holocaust is a tragic story of abandonment. My research, however, also focuses on the minority who did speak out, people like the Bergson Group and other activists who tried to move President Roosevelt. In those days, immigration, and I'm bringing up immigration because that was one of the obvious ways in which the United States might have helped Jews who were trying to escape from the Holocaust. Immigration to America was governed by a quota system, which set a maximum number of people who could come to America from any particular country each year. So, for example, the quota from Germany in the 1930s and 1940s was approximately 27,000. But the fascinating thing about Jewish immigration from Germany to America in those years is that that quota was almost never filled. In 11 of FDR's 12 years in office, the quota from Germany was filled only once. And in most of those years, the quota was more than 75% unfilled. Only a quarter or less of those quota spots were used. And at the end of the year, those unused immigration places didn't go over into the next year. They were discarded. So altogether, if you add up the number of unused quota places from Germany in the 30s, and then later from Axis-occupied countries in the 40s, we find that nearly 200,000 Jews could have been brought to America within the existing quota laws without having any public controversy or any change in the immigration system, except to simply allow the quotas to be used. But President Roosevelt and his State Department, which was in charge of immigration, had a deliberate policy of trying to suppress the number of Jewish refugee immigrants far below what the law allowed. They set up administrative obstacles, things that made it difficult for people to qualify for visas. And as a result, many quota places that could have been used to save lives were simply squandered.
Would you say FDR was anti-Semitic?
It's a question that I'm often asked because it's natural to wonder, what are the motives when a president makes any particular policy decision? And as we know, there are usually a mixture of motives. There are political motives, questions of political interest, popular opinion. There are issues involving Congress. FDR did face a difficult Congress, which was largely opposed to immigration and very isolationist. And of course, those were the years of the Great Depression. There was a lot of public opposition to immigration and also a lot of domestic anti-Semitism.
Well, the Christian Front had as many as 100,000 members, and they were a Christian group that actually wanted to establish a dictatorship and get rid of the Jews in America. You had in New York, you had groups like the Bund in the east side of Manhattan marching. So you had a lot of anti-Semitism. There were over 100 hate groups. So I understand the climate, but at the same time, the fact is they could have taken in immigrants under the quota that already existed. So that motivates me to ask the question where he had to be kicking and yelling to do something in 1944, but his gut wasn't there. Nancy Pelosi's father bucked the president.
Well, as I researched the question of whether or not anti-Semitism played a role in FDR's mindset and decision-making, I have focused on three particular ways in which the United States, the Roosevelt administration, could have saved Jews. And in each case, I've asked myself, what could have motivated the president to make such great efforts not to save them? The first is the question of immigration, the unused quota places. Why go out of his way to suppress immigration below what the law allowed? He could have simply said to the State Department, quietly use the existing quotas. We're not going to change them. I'm not going to start a public controversy, but the law is the law. That was number one. Number two, when Jewish groups like the Berkson Group asked the Roosevelt administration to take steps to help the Jews, they were often told there are no ships available to bring refugees back from Europe. But in fact, we know, and it was known at the time, that ships which were bringing soldiers and weapons to Europe, known as Liberty ships, would unload their cargo in Europe and return to America empty. In fact, because they were empty, they had to be loaded down with something to keep them from capsizing. This material, known as ballast, came from rubble of bombed out English cities. So why not allow Jews to come back on those ships and serve as the ballast, for example? And the third is perhaps the most famous episode from that period, the refusal of the Roosevelt administration to bomb the railways and bridges leading to Auschwitz. And the reason that's important is because we know, and again was known at the time, that American planes were bombing right around Auschwitz, within a few miles of the gas chambers, in 1944. So again, why did the administration lie to American Jewish groups and say it was impossible for American planes to reach Auschwitz, when they knew, in fact, they were bombing German oil factories in and around Auschwitz for months in the summer and fall of 1944? So with these three dilemmas before me, I examined the question of Roosevelt's personal mindset and whether any personal prejudices could have played a role. Over the course of the past decade, I and other historians have found about 15 comments that Roosevelt made in private, which were unquestionably what we would call anti-Semitic.
For example,
these are questions in which he would make a disparaging reference to Jewish blood. In some of the comments, he complains about there being too many Jews in various professions. There are several comments where he talks about how you can't allow too many Jews to live in one particular part of the country, or they will start to dominate the economy or dominate the culture. He tended to look at Jews as being a generally unwelcome, an unwelcome part of American society. Franklin Roosevelt's vision for America was a country that would be overwhelmingly white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. In saying that, I'm not suggesting anything unusual or radical. That's well known and described by his many biographers. But what I'm suggesting is that all of his comments about Jews being too aggressive and threatening and disloyal, these suggest to me that the reason he didn't want more Jewish refugees coming in through the existing quotas is because he did not want to have too many Jews in America. He said so himself in so many words. Now, the fascinating corollary to this is research done on Roosevelt's decision to intern Japanese Americans in 1942, not research by me, but by a professor at Montreal named Greg Robinson, who wrote a book called By Order of the President, revealed how in the 1920s and later, Roosevelt wrote in some newspaper articles and said in private comments a number of very ugly things about Asian Americans and about how they could not be trusted. And there was something in their blood that made them disloyal. And you can't allow them to concentrate in large numbers around the country. And this apparently was the background to his decision to order the internment of 130,000 Japanese Americans without any evidence that they were disloyal. In comparing the things that Roosevelt said privately about Asian Americans and the things that have been documented that he was saying about Jews, I found a common thread that he saw both Asians and Jews as essentially undesirable. He accepted the fact that there were a certain number already in America, but he did not want more of them coming in, and therefore he could shut the doors, even though Jews were fleeing for their lives from Germany, or he could have Japanese Americans rounded up, stripped of their possessions in effect, and sent off to detention camps in the desert.
So it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. It is a duck. He's a racist and anti-Semite. He didn't incarcerate Germans, which were more ordained. There were lots of problems with German Americans, including some of the work for Hitler in the United States. He didn't incarcerate Germans, but Japanese, and didn't allow Jews in. That certainly speaks to who he is. Our guest is Dr. Rafael Medoff. He's a founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, author of more than 20 books. We went through quite a few of them, not all of them, about Jewish history, the Holocaust. His latest book is America and the Holocaust, a documentary history, published by the JPS and University of Nebraska Press. So Roosevelt was a racist, it was an anti-Semite, at least from how you described him, but also the climate. You mentioned about the bombing of Auschwitz. According to Professor Joseph Podursky in a book, he did a historian about the Army. He says the Army was very anti-Semitic. The reason why they didn't bomb Auschwitz, they viewed Jews as being subhuman beings. Similar to what Goebbels wrote about the Jews as the Army documents about the Jews. So you had a lot of anti-Semitism prevalent in all different areas, where you had the Christian Front, you had the Bund, you had the Defense Department, you had Roosevelt. You had a lot of factors involved. So it makes it even more amazing that you had Nancy Pelosi's father, Congressman Representative D'Alessandro, was able to buck the trend. You see what the power the president has, and look the society around. That makes it even more impressive.
Because even though there were a lot of anti-Semites in those days, and there are a lot of anti-Semites today, there were also many good people. And there were decent people like Thomas D'Alessandro Jr., who was a congressman in the 1940s, and then later mayor of Baltimore, who simply out of basic humanitarianism, as the goodness of his heart, wanted to help the Jews in their hour of need. So even though President Roosevelt regarded the Berkson Group as practically his enemy, he deeply resented their pressure and their protests and their newspaper ads. D'Alessandro, a loyal Roosevelt Democrat, sided with the Berkson Group. I should note that D'Alessandro was so so supportive of President Roosevelt that he even named his first son, Nancy Pelosi's eldest brother, Franklin Roosevelt de Alessandro. And yet, despite a congressman, of course, always needing the president for political support, yet he defied the president. He put his name on those Bergson Group ads. And in doing so, he made a statement. And that's exactly what FDR needed to hear. He needed to know that the cries for rescue of the Jews were not just coming from his critics, from Republicans or others, but they were coming from stalwart liberal Democrats from his own party, like Nancy Pelosi's father. So when I discovered,
was he overall a liberal? Is that how we would classify him?
Congressman D'Alessandro certainly was a liberal, and Nancy Pelosi learned the essence of her politics at his knee. When I discovered Congressman D'Alessandro's connections to the Bergson Group, I brought it to the attention of Speaker Pelosi some years ago, and she wrote a book called in 2008 called "Know Your Power," encouraging young American women to become involved in the political world. And there she talked about how thrilled she was to learn this about her father. She had not known this previously, that he had been a supporter of the Bergson Group's efforts to promote rescue. And she connected his support for the Bergson Group and for rescuing Jews, she connected that to her own outspokenness with regard to China when she confronted Bill Clinton. And that leads me to think that some of that was in her mind as well when this past week she defied President Biden and went to Taiwan to show her support for the Taiwanese government against the communist Chinese.
Was it interesting that her father never discussed with her the role he played? They signed up to the Bergson Group. They were a right-wing group, and he certainly went against the mainstream, went against the president. I don't know if there was any repercussions by doing so. The president wields tremendous power. We see it even today. So I'm just surprised that she didn't even know about it until you brought it to her attention.
You know, President Roosevelt passed away in office in early 1945. With America on the verge of victory in World War II, and he passed into history as a venerated figure, and deservedly so. And it may be, I'm just speculating here, that that Congressman D'Alessandro was uncomfortable, speaking critically about the late president. I would also say that his association with the Bergson Group was not a major aspect of his political life, but let me just also add that during the administration of Harry Truman, who succeeded FDR, D'Alessandro continued his association with the Bergson Group, spoke at rallies for the creation of the State of Israel that were held in Baltimore in 1947. Again, at a time when the Truman administration found the Bergson Group to be a real irritant, and Truman was not, as we know, an enthusiastic supporter of the idea of creating a Jewish state. Right up until the moment that he finally supported its creation. And so once again,
and he also had some choice words about Jews too, right? He also said terrible things about Jews.
He certainly did. So D'Alessandro again defied a Democratic president in order to say and do the right thing, and that's something worth remembering. And clearly, Speaker Pelosi, in retrospect, feels that streak of political courage and humanitarianism that characterized her father's political career was something that she considered to be and considers to be inspiring.
Now, it certainly is inspiring. I was curious because you also write, and this is an important factor, FDR, President Roosevelt, did not want to save Jews, did not want to bring them in. The record also shows even American Jewish citizens overseas were not helped by the United States to get them back to America. That's another book. I don't know if you've written that, another chapter in the terrible things that were done to Jews in this country during World War II. But President Roosevelt was forced in early 1944, thanks to Nancy Pelosi's father and others, to establish a war refugee board, which did save Jews. Well,
throughout World War II, and the years before that, President Roosevelt very stubbornly resisted all of the cries from the American Jewish community to do something to help the Jewish refugees. The Bergson Group in 1943 turned to Congressman D'Alessandro and other members of Congress with an idea that they could get Congress to put pressure on Roosevelt, since president, the White House, and the State Department were not responding to appeals for rescue action. So the Berkson Group went to Congress and convinced members of Congress to introduce a resolution calling for the creation of a government rescue agency. The president strongly opposed this for the same reasons we've been discussing. And in fact, he sent his Assistant Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long, to Capitol Hill to testify against that resolution. What happened was an interesting kind of twist of fate that nobody expected. And that was that Assistant Secretary Long, in his testimony, went so overboard in his attempts to claim that America already had been rescuing Jews that he presented wildly exaggerated statistics to Congress, which then leaked out, caused a controversy, embarrassed the administration, and suddenly the resolution, which FDR was trying to kill, was on the verge of being adopted by Congress. In fact, it was passed unanimously by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was headed for a full vote in the Senate, and it was just then, and now I'm speaking about the very beginning of 1944, an election year, it was just then that Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau and some of his senior aides in the Treasury Department decided that they needed to go to President Roosevelt and convince him to create this government rescue agency rather than have Congress embarrass him and force him into it by passing this resolution that the Berkson Group had been promoting. So this last-minute intervention by Morgenthau and his staff essentially presented FDR with a political dilemma. He could continue resisting all the pressure for rescuing the Jews, or he could throw a bone to the Jewish community. And that's what he did. He decided to unilaterally create the very rescue agency that he and his administration had been opposing up until 5 minutes before. And that's how the War Refugee Board came to be established. The president gave it almost no funding. And this is a remarkable fact, that 90% of the funding for this U.S. government agency was provided by private Jewish organizations, mostly the Joint and also the World Jewish Congress. But fortunately, the War Refugee Board was staffed by some of the same aides to Morgenthau who had been so crucial in first bringing the whole issue to President Roosevelt and bringing the War Refugee Board into existence. So with that dedicated staff and with money provided by private Jewish groups, the War Refugee Board was able to accomplish near miracles in the last 15 months of the war. Among other things, the board sponsored and financed the life-saving work of Raoul Wallenberg in Nazi-occupied Budapest. It's not that there's a direct line from members of Congress like D'Alessandro to the work of Raoul Wallenberg. But like most things in history, there were a chain of events that eventually led to something good. And that was pressure in Congress on Roosevelt from the Berkson Group, from Democrats and from Republicans in Congress, leading Morgenthau to confront the president, leading the president to create the War Refugee Board, and then the War Refugee Board taking on an attitude of, you know, it was if there's a will, there's a way. They found ways to rescue Jews. For years, FDR and his spokesman had been saying, there's no way to rescue the Jews. We'd like to, but it's impossible. But the War Refugee Board proved that, in fact, if there had simply been a desire, an effort, people could be saved. And historians calculate that during those last 15 months of the War Refugee Board played a major role in the rescue of about 200,000 Jews from the Holocaust. Imagine how many more might have been saved if the board had been established even a few months earlier, if FDR and his administration had not been trying to block that resolution and prevent the board from coming into existence.
So a lot of Jewish blood on Roosevelt's hands, even though American Jews venerated Roosevelt. What was the Yiddish expression? Dem Welt, Jenem Welt, and Roosevelt. This world, the other world, and Roosevelt. American Jews loved him, but I guess they didn't realize, or did they? Did they realize the extent of how he hated Jews, or he didn't like them?
They did not realize the extent to which the administration could have rescued more Jews, but was obstructing rescue and was even suppressing news about the mass killings. Average American Jews did not realize it because the most prominent Jewish leaders of that era, like Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, were deeply loyal to President Roosevelt and did not share with the Jewish community at large what he and they knew about the president's abandonment of Europe's Jews.
Few moments that we have left. Nancy Pelosi's father was a hero. He was able to buck his party, buck his president, and push for resettling of Jews in America, which was successful with the War Refugee Board. You mentioned he was a supporter of Israel. Are you going to try to interview Speaker Pelosi about her father or have engaged in a conversation? I'm sure you may have more information that she may not be aware of.
Well, my colleagues and I have done extensive research in Congressman D'Alessandro's papers and other sources, and we provided that information to Speaker Pelosi, to her staff. They have the full story now about her father's political courage in these episodes. And I just want to add, we live in a time when everything seems to be divided along partisan political lines. When all the Democrats seem to line up on one side, all the Republicans on the other. For me, as a historian, as a human being, I find it encouraging to read about members of Congress like D'Alessandro and others who did not allow party loyalty to determine stands they should take on humanitarian issues.
Absolutely. And you're right. He would have been proud of his daughter Nancy's stand on Taiwan. And she's been strong about human rights, and she's been consistent and bucked both Republicans and Democratic presidents, as you're right, from Bush to Clinton. And even now to Joe Biden was not happy that the president was not happy that she went to Taiwan. As we close out, as far as Israel's concerned, has she taken I know she's been a supporter of Israel. Has she taken strong stands as well regarding Israel?
Well, certainly Speaker Pelosi has been consistently pro-Israel throughout her career. I don't think anyone accuses her of anything else. There's, of course, a great struggle in the Democratic Party now about attitudes towards Israel, and there are those who are unfriendly to Israel and would like her to be unfriendly to Israel. But fortunately, she has so far resisted those pressures.
But there's pressure on her to even get rid of the squad, the AOCs, and the others that are very anti-Israel, that have a big role in the Democratic Party. And so far, the Democratic, not just her, but the Democratic leadership has not really done anything to stop the squad.
Well, both parties today face the problem of extreme elements who bring dishonor to their parties, and the battles within both major parties may go on for years until a clear direction is resolved. But fortunately, broadly speaking, both parties are pro-Israel. Their party platforms are strongly pro-Israel, but what lies ahead, who knows? Because as you note, there are younger members of Congress, younger Democrats, who are much less sympathetic to Israel, and whether they will ultimately determine the shape of the party remains to be seen.
Dr. Rafael Medoff, the founder director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, author of more than 20 books. His latest one is called America and the Holocaust, a documentary history. Thank you for sharing some thoughts about Nancy Pelosi's father, which is just amazing how she's following in his footsteps, championing human rights. Look forward to having you back. Do you have any idea what your next book is going to be about, number 21?
There is another book in the works. It's a little too soon to share any information about it, but before long, you'll be hearing about it.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.